Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hope you're having an amazing day. If you're fancying picking up an RTX 5090, then I've got some bad news for you. It seems that the launch of the RTX 5090 is going to be delayed, and rumours online are swirling that instead, Nvidia will focus on launching the RTX 5080 first, and then we may not even get the 5090 until later this year. So I've been reaching out to some sources, and perhaps I've managed to find some reasons as to why Nvidia are doing this, plus some other bits and pieces as well. I'm going to talk to you guys about this because obviously, well, the RTX 50 series is a very big launch indeed, and there is a massive specification difference between the GB202 and GB203 specifications. So yeah, let's get into all of this plus more after this quick message from the sponsor of the video. If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices. So I'm going to give you guys a quick history of the rumours concerning the launch of the RTX 50 series. This is going to be really quick and abbreviated, but basically the original rumours seem to indicate that it would be late this year or perhaps even next year. Nvidia would launch the RTX 5090 and 5080. The specifications, there's been a lot of them that have been floating around, and we'll talk more about those later, but basically that was the general plan. Then more recently, this had been updated to say that Q3 / maybe early Q4, we would see the RTX 5080 and 5090 essentially launch simultaneously. This has been kind of similar to what Nvidia have done in the past. But this no longer seems to be the case. Coppertite7, who is a very well-known leaker for all things Nvidia, has recently stated that the 5080 would be the card which launches, and at some point in the future, the 5090 would, well, appear. Now, I decided to hold out on reporting this rumour for a couple of days because, quite frankly, I wanted to speak to some sources because I was getting so much conflicting information. And the TLDR here is that, yes, this does indeed seem to be the plan. The RTX 5090 was planned to launch later this year, and I'll get more into possibly the reasons it's been delayed in a moment, but now it seems to only be the RTX 5080 according to one source who's spoken to a couple of AIBs, and another person also told me that up until a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago depending, both cards had essentially been what he thought were going to launch, but now obviously things may have changed. Now I do want to stress at this point I don't have any specific information concerning other SKUs, so basically the RTX 5090, I don't know when it's going to appear. My speculation, and I'm probably wrong here, is going to be at some point next year, maybe the first half. But it may also depend on a lot of other factors, and you'll see more what I mean in a moment. As for things like the RTX 5070, well, those will also be very interesting indeed. Now, let's talk about the reasons. So one source told me that one of the big reasons the RTX 5090 is going to be delayed, do remember that that's based on GB202, and again, we'll get into the specifications in just a moment, but you'll see why there is such a big gap between the specifications of the 5090 and potentially the 5080 in a second. But basically, I was told that one of the big reasons are because of the bans that are happening with exports into China for, well, certain levels of GPU compute performance. Now, you may have heard of the RTX 4090D that Nvidia basically created in an effort to circumvent those restrictions, and that's a whole story in and of itself that I'm not going to kind of, talk about here. You can Google it if you're not too familiar with it. I suspect many of you are. But that would be quite interesting because it would mean, hypothetically anyway, that the 5080 would maybe not beat the RTX 4090 in terms of raw compute. Now, do remember that compute isn't necessarily everything anyway, because allegedly there are some really big changes with Blackwell for the gaming variants, for the SMs. So you can't just be like, well, this has X, that has Y. This is going to certainly be better because, again, we're talking about two generations of different products. So it's very difficult to know because we don't have a complete picture yet as to what's going on. Now, another reason I was given by another source, and I don't know whether both are partially correct or one is correct and the other is not correct. So another reason I've heard is that the dies for GB202 will basically first be prioritized for things like professional usage. Now remember, if you look at AD102, you can look at this on like Tech Power Up or whatever, that is found of course in the RTX 4090, but it's also found in professional level products like the L40. Now I don't know what the next generation products based on Blackwell for this die are going to be called, but let's just call it L40 version 2 for the sake of this video. Now, from my understanding, GB202 is supposedly really, really big. It is a monolithic die, it is not chiplet from what I understand, but it's somewhere close to around 700 square millimeters. So it's really, really big. It's actually larger than AD102, so perhaps that's also a part of it. Now, this does mean that there are a lot of interesting questions. Basically, gamers are going to be left with a very interesting choice, particularly for those who currently have like a 4090, because of course it's all going to depend on the price. Let's hypothetically say, for the sake of this video, that the 5080 is 10 or 20 or 30% faster than the 4090 in gaming. Is that going to be enough to entice you to pick it up? Well, of course, it's going to depend heavily on the price. The 4080 from memory was like $1,200 MSRP for the Founders Edition model. Obviously, well, let's just say prices vary. But yeah, you can definitely see a lot of people just not wanting to upgrade. Because also there's the mental thing. It's like, well, you're going from a 90 class product to an 80 class product. That's kind of a hard sell, even technically speaking, if it's faster. Because, well, basically speaking, that the, RTX 5090 or whatever it ends up being called will eventually launch. On the other hand, if you're someone who's been rocking, let's say like a GTX 1080, I can definitely understand a lot of folks saying, well, you know what, that's a really big leap. So again, it's going to be very much what you feel comfortable paying. And let's just be honest, guys, the 5090 is not going to be cheap. I think we can all agree that this thing is going to be very costly. Now let's talk about the specifications. Now I have had some conflicting specs regarding GB203. I'm sure we'll get much more solid information as we get closer to launch, because again, this is the GB203 or the GB202. It may of course be cut down a little bit for, whatever specification. So for example, RTX 4080 would have stuff disabled and so on. But, so yeah. One set of specs I had is 108 SM for 203 and 202 had 192. You could see that the bus width is essentially half for GB203. And again, it's PCIe 5. I've had 64 megabytes of L2 and 96 respective of 203 and 202. However, I also was given updated specifications. I believe the cache sizes for L2 are the same, but 96 SM 256-bit for 203, and 202 is 192 and 512. For what it's worth, Coppertight 7 also believes 96 is correct for 203. When I received some of the specifications of the 100 and odd SM for 203, I was told that those were quite early simulations and stuff would definitely change, so it's very possible 96 is correct. Now, I don't need to tell you guys that there is a massive difference. It's essentially 2x. Now, again, how much they cut down, let's say GB202 to make a 5090, I'll let you guys guess. Let's say, hypothetically, it's like 170 odd or a high 160s. Let's say 160 to 170-ish SM, depending on how you want to split it. Obviously, if they cut down the 203 silicon, there is a big difference. You can't directly, of course, say, well, it's 2x gaming performance because things don't quite scale linearly like that, especially in many games. But there is going to be a big difference between a 5080 and a 5090. Now, I had heard the clocks do hit north of 3 gigahertz, which honestly I do think does make some sense for this, but basically speaking, assuming the 5080 does use GB203 and 202 is found in the 5090, this would be a kind of similar strategy from what we saw with AD102 and AD103. There's basically a 60% difference in the full dies in terms of CUDA cores. So it's going to be really interesting because it would theoretically mean that Nvidia are widening the gap even more between the 5090 and the 5080. Again, depending on how they essentially decide to cut down the configurations. They may decide, for example, to release a 5080 Ti, a 5090, a 5090 Ti, because it doesn't seem like we're going to be getting that with the 4090 Ti, which is interesting, as there were a lot of rumors that I was hearing that it was going to happen, but obviously that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So I'm going to be very interested to see what Nvidia actually does here. If it is because of the whole China thing, and if that's true, that would be very curious, that Nvidia basically are delaying the launch. I could also see that being a part of it, but also the fact that they are basically prioritizing certain dies for specific usage. I would also be very interested to see what it has to do with things like yields and TSMC as well. Either way, it's going to be fascinating to see how the next generation unfolds. Obviously, RDNA 4 is rumored to launch later this year, but I don't need to tell you guys, you know, it's not going to be a high-end performance part. Maybe also that's part of it. Maybe Nvidia are kind of like, well, let's get the lower end out of the way so that we can basically compete more favorably with RDNA 4, and then we can kind of reassess when RDNA 5 is closer. It's going to be very interesting, honestly, to see how RDNA 5 actually ends up competing against Nvidia. I've heard RDNA 5 is really, really, really good. I'm getting some conflicting information regarding the specifications, but depending on who you ask, some people tell me that Blackwell was designed to compete with RDNA 5 and therefore surpass it, and others are telling me it's exactly the reverse. It is RDNA 5 was designed to compete with Blackwell and surpass it. So in other words, no matter what Nvidia does on a monolithic die, theoretically, RDNA 5 should be able to beat it. Now, RDNA 5, allegedly anyway, of course, is like a chiplet design, blah, blah, blah. So in theory, anyway, I could see that. I'll also be interested to see if Nvidia does some type of refresh for RTX 50. I had heard that they were going to do that, but honestly, it was very wishy-washy information. And it's like, well, with a refresh, are you literally talking about, like, just the same thing as we've seen with, like, RTX 40 Super, for example? Or are you talking about an actual refresh? In other words, there's some actual differences in the specifications, or perhaps there's some upgrades in the architecture or something or another. It's going to be very interesting to see which direction Nvidia goes. I am very hyped about RTX 50. With that said, if the 5080 does launch first, it does kind of suck. I always really like to see what the flagship can do. Even if it's like too expensive for the majority of people, I just think it's very cool to see like what the most balls to the wall configuration is, you know, can do. But anyway, let me know your thoughts on this one, guys. I'll be very interested to see if this rumor changes again. If Nvidia decides to, because, you know, the rumor is that the 5090, you know, the design is, or should I say, it would be more accurate to say 202, you know, the design, it's not like it hasn't been taped out or something like that. It's not like the it's not like the engineers are still like, where do we put the memory controller? You know, it's everything's essentially done at this point. So it's like, they could certainly launch it this year, at least according to all of the rumors. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether this rumor changes yet again. The thing about Nvidia, and you may recall this from like a couple of years ago with all of the specification changes for the 4090, actually, ironically, like Nvidia just kind of changes stuff as and when. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens for this. I will be very curious also to see what situation we're in for AMD's RDNA 4 in terms of pricing. With that said, guys, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.